The rains refused to fall on the land. The once green fields turned brown as the crops withered under the scorching sun. The drought continued for several months, resulting in a harsh famine. People left the villages and towns in droves, including farm laborers. Dele wasn't spared. The next morning, before her baby, the old widow woke up. Dele had cleared all the bushes surrounding the farmhouse. Everywhere looked tidy and kept. Her baby was very happy with him. As she and Dele sat down for breakfast, Dele asked her baby to lease the abandoned farmlands to him for 2 years. He'd pay her in full. Her baby smiled, but offered to give Dele the farmlands to farm for free. The farmlands had lain fallow for many years since her husband's death. It would be her pleasure if someone put them to use. Besides, she was old and grey, without an heir. What would she do with this money? After much persuasion, her baby agreed to take payment, but in crops. Dele would give her 10% of the farm produce. Dele agreed. Straight away, Dele went into action. He employed servants to clear the land. Although it was late in the farming season, Dele planted various crops on the land because it was very large. He planted corn, cassava, yam, and tomatoes. Every day, Dele worked on the farm with his laborers. They were shocked to see their master doing farm work with them, which made them work even harder. Our baby admired his work ethic. He reminded her of her late husband. When Dele got home, he still assisted with chores. He had gradually become the son she never had. Then came the rains, showers of blessings on the earth. The crops blossomed and the fields were green with blessings. A few months later, it was time for Dele to harvest his corn and tomatoes. The soil was so fertile that it gave Dele a bountiful harvest of large crops. He gave the widow her 10%, sold 70%, and kept 20% for them to eat. However, her baby pretended to sell her 10% to some men, but she had actually hired them to distribute it to the poor in Ori village and the neighboring towns. When people asked who the food was from, they said it was from Ola, the mighty farmer, just as her baby had instructed them. 2 yam harvests later, Akin was growing impatient, waiting to ascend the throne. Although the current king was old and grey, the Baba did not look like he'd join his ancestors soon, with his new young wife by his side. Akin could no longer hide his frustration. How will I ever become king if this man lives forever? He vented to Duku. Patience, Bale. You are still young. Your time will come, Duku assured him. But Akin was not one to wait for time. He was a man of destiny, the foretold one. He must find a way to speed things up. Meanwhile, far away in Ori village, Dele had become the biggest farmer in the village and surrounding towns just after 2 yam harvests. His hard work and diligence had paid off. He had bought more acres of farmland to add to the old widows. People far and near came in numbers to buy his crops. Dele built a magnificent farmhouse for the old widow, and her baby continued continued to secretly distribute her share of the crops amongst the poor, saying they were from Ola, the mighty farmer of Ori. The fame of Ola, the mighty and generous farmer, spread throughout the kingdom, yet no one knew who he really was. He remained an enigma. And so Dele continued to prosper, but in 6 full moons, things would take a dark turn. The rains refused to fall on the land. The once green fields turned brown as the crops withered under the scorching sun. The drought continued for several moons, resulting in a harsh famine. People left the villages and towns in droves, including farm laborers. Dele wasn't spared. The once richest farmer in the village now sat overwhelmed and desolate. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had changed. One day, while lost in his sorrowful thoughts, he had an unexpected visitor. Otumba, the farmer he once worked for, had come to visit the farm of Ola, the mighty farmer of Ori. Dele was surprised to see him. Otumba, seeing Dele, assumed he was one of Ola's servants. "I came to see your master, Ola the mighty farmer," Otumba said. Dele stared at him in confusion. "Never mind, the same fate has befallen us all. I am heading east. I hear they were spared from the famine." "You are leaving?" Dele asked in disbelief. "Yes, and you should come with me too. You were always very hardworking. I could use someone like you as I start over in the new land." Dele hesitated. "A servant again?" "Don't take too long to decide, my boy. I leave at dawn the day after tomorrow. I am staying in the next town," Otumba said before leaving. Dele stood transfixed. What did all this mean? Had the gods reduced him to nothing, as the seer had prophesied? Meanwhile, 2 days' journey from Dele, Ola sat outside her mother's hut with a forlorn expression. The famine had hit her village so hard, but the news of Otumba leaving town only made things worse. To survive the famine, Ola's mother advised her to return to Akin and be his wife. Ola objected. "But mother, I cannot marry Akin. Our situation may be dire, but I cannot do it." "Everyone is leaving the village," Ola's mother said. "We cannot stay here and starve." Ola pondered on her mother's words. She was right. They had to leave. But she would only go to Iba to find work. She wanted nothing to do with Akin or his friend Dele. The pains of the past still lingered. Meanwhile, a day's journey from Ola, Akin had become notorious for using the famine to instigate the elders and kingmakers against the king. "If I were king, I would have solved this food problem, even if it meant importing food from the north," Akin lamented. "But you can only be king if the present Oba dies," said a kingmaker. "That is, if we don't all die in the famine," Akin said gloomily. The kingmaker absorbed Akin's words with fear. Elenu, another kingmaker and trusted confidant of the king, went to the king and told him everything Akin was doing. "The people are starving and would do anything to survive. You must act fast," he advised the king. The famine had become so severe that Akin was feeding more than half of the king's council members and kingmakers. He had their ears and hearts. You must open your barn and feed the people. Send servants far and near to buy food for them. If the people's heart are with you, it will be hard to install a different king over them, Elenu advised the king. The king pondered Elenu's words. They were full of wisdom and truth, as always. Meanwhile, back in Ori village, Dele and her baby sat down to breakfast in silence. Dele hadn't touched his meal. His mouth was dry and bitter. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep. You should follow Otumba. Her baby broke the silence. Huh? Dele was pulled out of his thoughts. You should follow Otumba. He will treat you well, her baby repeated. I can't. I can't go back to being a servant again. I can't, Dele protested. We don't know how long the famine will last. You spent all your cowries on those farmlands, our baby reminded him. Maybe the seer was right. I am destined to be a servant. Even the heavens are against me, Dele grunted heavily. That night, Dele resolved to join Otumba on his journey. Maybe his destiny was to be a servant after all. In his sadness, he remembered Ola. Being a servant would have been easier with her by his side. If only things had worked out between them. If only. Dele fell asleep and slipped into a dream. He saw himself in the midst of a merchant caravan. He recognized the colorful camels and saw Yaya sitting under a tree. You were wrong, Yaya, Dele vented. I worked diligently, but the heavens rewarded me with famine. Yaya remained calm and gestured for Dele to sit with him. Are you the only one experiencing the famine? He asked. No, the whole kingdom. Every farmer is affected, Dele replied. Yaya smiled. I did not become the wealthiest merchant in the region by thinking and acting like the average merchant. I became great because I could turn my challenges into profitable opportunities. Dele listened attentively. Sometimes, if the things you need do not come to you, you go to them, Yaya said. Dele woke up from his slumber. It was already past dawn. Otumba's expedition would have left by now. As Dele walked through the farmhouse compound, he felt invigorated, having had a good night's sleep for the first time in weeks. He pondered Yaya's words. What could they mean? Then his eyes fell on a servant fetching water from the well. Suddenly, it hit him. If the rains could not come to him, he could dig the ground to find water. Foreman, assemble everyone, Dele called out to his remaining servants. In a few hours, Dele and his servants were hard at work, digging wells in the farmlands. The next day, they found water, and their joy knew no bounds. They soaked the parched soil with water and began to till it. Dele took a portion of the grains and tubers from the food supply and planted them on the farmlands. Now, we water the farms as the rains would have done it for us, he told his servants. Meanwhile, back in the king's city, Akin's troubles compounded. The king had heeded to Elenu's advice. He opened his barns and fed the people. Even the elders, who were loyal to Akin, benefited from the king's benevolence, so much that they now sang a different tune. These are trying times, Baale, one of the kingmakers told Akin. The king is trying his best. Akin was devastated. His plans had been scuttled. The hearts of the people were back to their king. He was left with only one choice: elimination. As you would have guessed by now, Dele's fortunes had completely turned around. His farmlands were now lush and vibrant with crops, bustling with the energy of countless laborers who had returned to work the soil. People from neighboring towns and even distant regions flocked to buy his produce. In just 12 full moons, his lot had changed. Meanwhile, our baby continued to give out her 10% to the poor in the village and neighboring towns in the name of Ola, the mighty farmer, feeder of the poor who farms without rain. Among those who came to buy crops were the king's servants, led by Elle, the king's trusted chief. Dele was surprised and delighted to see the king's servants at his doorstep. We are seeking the one called Ola, the mighty farmer, feeder of the poor who farms without rain. Dele stared at him in confusion. Ola who? But a baby stepped in. You are in the right place, she told Elle, and you are standing in his presence. Then the king's servants presented gifts and bags of cowries to Dele. Thereafter, Ababi asked them to stay for the night. You can journey back to the palace after you are well rested and refreshed, she told them. Elle accepted with thanks. Then Dele called Ababi aside when the king's servants were taken to their quarters. Mother, what was that all about? He asked. Who is Ola, the mighty farmer? Is your name not Olamidele? She retorted. Are you not a mighty farmer? Dele still did not understand. The old widow now confessed to him what she had been doing with her 10% of the crops. As a result of her actions, his fame had spread abroad and brought the king to his doorstep. Dele prostrated and thanked the widow. She has indeed been a selfless mother whose kind gestures had opened up his destiny. It was a busy evening in the farm settlements of Ola, the mighty farmer, and Ola had been reassigned to the kitchen of the farmhouse compound. The king's servants had visited, and more hands were needed to prepare a great feast for them. Yes, Ola had been working here for 6 full moons now. She had gone with her mother to work for Akin, but when Akin realized that she would never agree to be his wife, he assigned her the tedious of labors for a meager pay. Then, when she heard of Ola, the mighty farmer, feeder of the poor, who farmed without rain, she decided to come work for him. Upon arriving the farmlands of Ola the mighty farmer with her mother, Ola was overwhelmed by the sight. The green lands with lush crops were a stark contrast to the parched lands they had left behind. The farm settlement was a bustling community, embodying a community spirit that Ola found comforting. The head foreman assigned Ola to the settlement's kitchen, deeming her too delicate for the difficult farm work. For all the 6 moons she had worked in the settlement kitchen, never setting her eyes on Ola, the mighty farmer. Her days were filled with endless tasks, and every evening she would collapse, exhausted but fulfilled, having contributed to the feast that fed many. Ola, where are the yams? Snapped her superior, jolted her back to the present task, and she hurried off. That evening, Dele had come to the yam barns to select the best yams as a gift to the king. Then he spotted a familiar face. Ola was there, picking yams from the barn with other women. Dele's heart skipped. It had been 3 yam harvests, yet the sight of her still stirred deep emotions within him. Ola, unaware of Dele's presence, continued in her chore as Dele approached. Ola, he called softly. Startled, she turned and saw Dele standing before her. A mix of emotions played across her face. Surprise, anger, and a glimmer of longing. Dele, she replied coldly.